shortly, but let's have a little bit of an update of matters military in Ukraine. What's the hot topic? Well, all of a sudden, we've apparently discovered that the British Army is in a dire state. This has come out from comments from the Americans. The Americans have basically said British military are now second rate and incapable of being effective on the modern battlefield. Now, with no disrespect to people serving in the military, many of whom I know do it out of a correct sense of loyalty and love of their country, the reality is they have been betrayed by governments since the end of the Cold War. Ever since Ben Bradshaw was on the BBC talking about the fall of the Berlin Wall, and that was the end of that system, the cuts came in with a vengeance. And we've now worked out that the truth is that we can't put an army into the field. We're lucky if we could get 20,000 men into the field. We'd be lucky if we've actually got 20,000 men within that military unit to get on the field. So the Express headline was interesting, because if we pop that one back on screen, of course, who was the man here? Well, it was Tobias Ellwood. He's getting stuck into Ben Wallace because, of course, Tobias Ellwood, if he's not part of 77 Brigade spying on the public, he knows everything about defence, and he's warned and warned that we should already be at war with the Russians. In fact, if we'd gone to war earlier, there wouldn't be a problem now. That's more or less what this man says. So interesting to see that as we tell the Ukrainians, trust us to train your troops and beat the Russians, the reality is that, of course, Britain's military is in a despicable state. We don't have the men, we don't have the weapons, we don't have the resupply, we haven't got the ammunition to fight a proper war. All of this is coming to the surface. So let's just have a look at this little video clip of Ben Wallace under pressure. This was a little while ago, but of course, this is nothing new. It's simply the case that the government has turned a blind eye to the real state of Britain's military.
Does that give out to the rest of the world?
Well, I think
we don't get a mention.
To be fair, you could ask the United States that. I mean, for me, I don't feel any lesser because of how many times I mentioned any report, or the UK is. Or the UK is. I mean, I think, when you talk about NATO, we're one of the biggest contributors. So when you talk about NATO, it is important. AUKUS, is a very clear strategic partnership that is not available to many other countries. So I suppose I don't worry about it, because I've had an experience over the last 3 and a bit years with the United States on both sides of the aisle, effectively, that has demonstrated only one thing, which is a constant trust and partnership with us at a level that I don't see in other countries around the world.
The US have mentioned 2 things, haven't they, that they were not happy with. One, the cutting of the army by 10,000, which, as you well know, I've campaigned against, and I mentioned it again today. And that's sort of one of their bugbears. And I'm also wondering that the 3% that logically we should be spending on defence in an increasingly unstable world, I wonder if we don't do that, whether the US will comment further that they're concerned about their greatest buddies not investing in something they think we should, and we think we should.
Well, I certainly think the US would always want to see us at the front of the pack, or in the top, the top few teams in the Premiership is what they would expect.
So, David, just very quickly, I have to comment on that dialogue, because, of course, the reality that they're talking about is not just 10,000 men in the army. It was to do with problems across the board. The Navy can't get ships to sea. The aircraft carriers don't work. We haven't got enough planes. But it's all discussed in this sort of bumbling understatement of the old boys club and who's going to be the top team. I find the dialogue and the manner in which they have it despicable, as the country's betrayed. Talking about some Englishmen there, so over to you.
Well, Brian, you've spent a lot of time in the Navy. You haven't had my level of experience of incompetent management. One of the signs of really weak management is football metaphors. So when people start saying, "Well, we're a Premier League club," or this is this is signs that they're no longer thinking clearly about anything. Right? They're no longer able to think clearly. They're no longer addressing the real issues. They're falling back onto lazy comparisons that really have no substance. And this is what we're seeing from Ben Wallace. We've got the ambition to be a world player in terms of power broking, in terms of the great game, in terms of international conflict, in terms of regime change in large and powerful countries. The ambition to do all of this without any of the means. So he's just hiding from the reality. This level of absence of careful thought and actually honesty. He has to stand ultimately on principles of honesty, because if our armed forces ever have to go into the field in a condition where they are thoroughly inadequate, many lives will be lost, and Ben Wallace and others in control and in power now will be responsible. It takes a long time to build up the ability within a military, and it doesn't take very long to wreck it.
Thank you very much for that, David. I heartily agree with that. They're not in the real world, they're bumbling around. Let's take people into the real world, and I was amused to see this in The Sun over the weekend. So here's the headline: shock and roll. Army hammering out emergency plan to keep Putin's hands off top secret British armour if tanks are damaged in Ukraine. So we've got the bizarre situation where Ben Wallace is going to put in the best that the British Army's got, and we're already worrying that these tanks could be captured. But how does all this work? We're going to defeat Russia with Challenger tanks, 14 of them, but the Army's already worried that its world-beating tank will be damaged and or fall into Russian hands as Ukraine wins the war. This is complete fantasy land. And let's just remind people with this little clip, this is of a Leopard being destroyed with a Soviet weapon in Syria. And the reality is that these Russian weapons are extremely good. And this is what faces both Challenger and Leopard and the Abrams tanks. But of course, we don't want to talk about the reality. This is a tragic little video clip. I'm playing it without sound, but this is another Ukrainian family man being dragged off to war. And the reality, despite the silence by the British government and the BBC and the Ministry of Defence, is that he will almost certainly be killed, with massive losses amongst the Ukrainians, well over 150,000 men killed and well over 500,000 injured. But we don't talk about casualties. We've simply got to keep pumping in the weapons. And of course, for the Ukrainians, they're going to keep pumping in the men as the cannon fodder. Now, Mike is going to shortly be talking about this gentleman, Admiral Rob Bauer from the Netherlands. Was intrigued to see on his Twitter page that he's getting very excited because we're welcoming Ukrainian cadets. So we've got 155 or more Ukrainian dead and 500,000 wounded. And we've got a Dutch admiral here, clearly happy. I've said grooming Ukrainian children for death, and that's exactly what this man is up to. So more despicable stuff here within NATO. Let's have a look at some of the reality on the ground. One of the key areas in eastern Ukraine is around this major town of Bakhmut. This has been heavily fortified over many years, and the Russians are playing a very clever game because there are no massive frontal assaults with men. They are simply standing off and killing Ukrainian with long-range weapons. But the red to the right of the picture shows the Russian advance, which is now breaking through the whole of this line, Bakhmut and the fortified towns and villages which run in a line north to Seversk. And once the Russians are through this, although there is another layer of defense further to the east, those defenses get successively weaker. So if you imagine the lava flow from a volcano, That is the way the Russian forces are approaching this, to minimize Russian casualties whilst they maximize Ukrainian casualties. And if I bring this one on screen, and I'm going to thank Military Advisor, because this is another of the social media reporters that are doing the work that the BBC can't or won't do, for example. But we've got another defended town up to the top right-hand corner. This is southwest of Donetsk, about 80 kilometers to the southwest of defense. So we've got a heavily fortified Ukrainian town. That says number one. And number two is an area southwest of Volodar there, which is also heavily defended as a strong point. And this is just a little bit of film to show what's happening on the battlefield in this area. So we're playing this out without sound, but you can see the reality of high-rise buildings, which of course allow observation of the surrounding countryside. So the Russians are simply not putting men forward. They're standing off and shelling the Ukrainian positions to pieces. And they will do this until they believe the defences are significantly weakened, and then they will advance. So that's the reality of the war in Ukraine, which the British Ministry of Defence would have us believe is at a stalemate. Nothing could be further from the truth. This is the defended area to the south of Volodar, which we've just shown on screen. And this is showing Grad missiles destroying this area, which is fortified as a separate position by the Ukrainians. So this is absolutely vile loss of life, but the Russians minimizing their own casualties whilst they're destroying the Ukrainians. And if we want to talk about sophistication, this is the Russians taking out a Ukrainian S-300 battery. Let's just bring the video clip on screen. Watch the top right-hand corner of the screen. Well, you'll see the initial impact, but I think people will be shocked as to what unfolds following this explosion once we zoom in and get a bit of a close-up. Note the open range countryside, where of course movement of troops can be spotted very easily from drones. So the Russians not falling into the trap of exposing their own troops. They are working forward to destroy the Ukrainians before they move forward. And the other thing happening, of course, on a regular basis is destruction of Western supplied equipment. Here's M777 howitzer, and this is what happens to this equipment once the Russians find it on the battlefield, as they're doing on a regular basis. So the destruction of this gun happens pretty quickly with a remote drone. And if we look at another built-up area here, this is showing what happens when Russian heavy weapons are unleashed. And you can see the size of these explosions, but also, again, see the devastation on screen. I think we'll stop that little video there because it just becomes worse and worse. And of course, men are dying in their thousands as those explosions take place. So, Mike, I'll just bring Admiral Rob Bauer back on screen here. We've got him honoured to meet the Ukrainian military representative to our session on Ukraine. He provided an update on the ongoing war, military progress and international support. And this bit caught my eye. NATO praised the Ukrainian military leadership who outmaneuver their opponent time and time again. The truth is the opposite. The Russians are outmaneuvering the Ukrainians and simply killing them where they stand. So I just find these reports very difficult to believe now, but the Dutch admiral there is part of the NATO propaganda machine. Meanwhile, let's hear what Zelensky has in store for Ukraine.
It is obvious that American business can become the locomotive that will once again push forward global economic growth. We have already managed to attract attention and have cooperation with such giants of the international financial and investment world as BlackRock, JP Morgan, and Goldman Sachs. Such American brands as Starlink or Westinghouse have already become part of our Ukrainian way. your brilliant defense systems, such as HIMARS or Bradleys, are already uniting our history of freedom with your enterprises. We are waiting for Patriots. We are looking closely at Abrams. Thousands of such examples are possible, and everyone can become a big business by working with Ukraine in all sectors, from weapons and defense to construction, from communication to agriculture, from transport to IT, from banks to medicine. And I believe that freedom must always win.
Well, Mike, we should get in there because
Absolutely.
Everybody is welcome in Ukraine. So there's the reality, of course, US big business and British, of course, and the military-industrial complex straight in there, plus the international banking cartels to own Ukraine. So this man, a complete traitor to his own people. He's given the country away, but he's got more Ukrainians to kill before the fighting is over.
No, it's one thing sending tanks, including Leopard tanks, to Ukraine, but of course, somehow you've got to get ammunition for those tanks. And so NATO and so on have been going cap in hand to just about every country in the world that has them to try and get that ammunition. One such country is Brazil. But Brazil has decided, as we can see here, that they are not going to supply ammunition for German tanks. So the article here from Interfax Ukraine says Brazil has rejected sending tank ammunition to Germany over concern that these shells would be handed over to Ukraine. So what can we say? Not going too well there. Also announced last week, if we're sticking with South America, that Colombia has also refused to donate weaponry, this time Russian weaponry. This was for Russian helicopters that Colombia flies. They don't want to send those to Ukraine either because they don't want them to turn into scrap metal, is what they're saying. And let's put this from Facebook. This is Oleg Nikolenko on Facebook. We'll just do a quick translation of this. He says, media, during a conversation with journalists, the Prime Minister of Hungary compared Ukraine to Afghanistan and called it a no man's land. Another disparaging statement by Viktor Orban against Ukraine. Such statements are categorically unacceptable. Budapest continues its course to deliberately destroy Hungarian-Ukrainian relations, significantly undermining the possibility of further dialogue between the two neighbouring countries. The Hungarian ambassador will be summoned to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for Ukraine for a frank conversation. We reserve the right to take other response measures. Now, we were talking about Hungary and so on last week, but what was Orban actually saying here? He was saying that really instead of arming Ukraine, the West should be seeking a ceasefire and peace talks. He said he did not believe in Ukraine's victory and the Ukraine is gradually turning into an uncontrollable ruin. So I think his comments quite appropriate, particularly bearing in mind what we were talking about on Wednesday's program last week. And here's the Express then, sticking with the weapons issue. NATO countries poised to send 50 fighter jets to Ukraine. So this is reporting that a club, as they describe it, of 7 countries, that's the UK, France, Belgium, Germany, the Netherlands, Italy, and Spain, called the European Air Group, met at High Wycombe Air Command last week to make arrangements for this. Well, there you go. We're going to be sending, we talked about this on the news last week, but it looks like it's going to happen.
Well, it's going to be a joke, Mike, because of course the air defences out there, the Russian air defences are second to none, which is why the Ukrainian Air Force does not exist anymore. And 50 aircraft put into the battlefield are not going to last long.
Yeah, indeed. So let's put Di Whittingham on screen. He's veteran RAF, also served with the Ministry of Defence and with NATO. And he said, some may say deploying Typhoons is a major escalation, but while it's not inevitable, it's really just a logical progression. What do we say about that?
Well, he's another madman because he doesn't know what he's stirring up and where this thing is going for. They are living in their own reality, Mike. I'm having difficulty with this because 50 jets thrown into this war are going to be gone in a couple of weeks.
Well, let's bring, yeah, indeed. Well, let's bring Rob Bauer on, Admiral Rob Bauer, who's the chair of the NATO Military Committee. Let's just have a quick listen.
Welcome, Admiral Bauer. You said about this Ukrainian war that it was a war of the past, a war of the future, in the present. What exactly do you mean by that?
Very often I hear from people that they say that the military is always preparing for the last war, and that they actually should prepare for the future war. And then people think about high technology, cyber, information warfare, hybrid warfare. And we all thought that the Russians would play that type of warfare much harder. And in the end, we found out that they are using tactics and procedures from the First World War, 1914, 1918. Huge artillery barrages, indiscriminate destruction, firing on civilian infrastructure, firing on military positions, and without a lot of movement, but with a lot of destruction and killing. And at the same time, there is cyber, there is information operations, there is drones. So you actually see that we are fighting, the Ukrainians are fighting the war of the past, the war of the future today at the same time.
Now,
sorry, Mike, were you confused by that? Because I was pretty confused as to what was in that man's head.
well, what's in that man's head, Brian, is British defence doctrine, because this is if you remember, you showed the publication a couple of weeks ago on this program, the Future Soldier document, which has come out of the integrated review and the integrated operating concept. That's exactly what he's expressing. So he's in a bit of cognitive dissonance there, because this has been the way they've been thinking, not just in the UK but in Europe as well. This future war, this future soldier concept,
and the Russians are not playing
and
ball.
they're not playing ball. So this has put them in a bit of difficulty. But let's have a little bit more, because that was a 20-minute interview, and we've just obviously just shown 1 minute of it. But this was the point. NATO is prepared for a direct confrontation with Russia. Rearmament is the alliance's top priority. So I'm a bit confused about how he's saying NATO is prepared, but they have to focus on rearmament, because actually they're not prepared.
Yeah.
Right. So there you go. And then he went on to say the fact that your enemy has better weapons is not the problem for the enemy. It's your problem. Well, perhaps there's a bit of reality creeping in there, but nonetheless, he seems a bit confused about things.
Yeah, totally confused. But we've shown the pictures of what's going on the battlefield. The fact the Russians are moving slowly is nothing to do with the fact they're not capable. They're moving slowly because they kill more Ukrainians and save the lives of more Russians by doing that. And they're using weapon systems that basically NATO, the British and the Americans can only dream of. Let's remember those hypersonic missiles. NATO, the US, UK, the EU does not have an answer to them. This is one of the reasons why we're not hearing a dicky bird about American aircraft carriers, because the Americans can't put aircraft carriers in the Mediterranean, where they could, in days gone by, have an influence with the air warfare or a no-fly zone. Those carriers are completely at the mercy of those Russian missiles. So this is why all of a sudden there's certain areas of the US rhetoric have just disappeared from the scene. We better end it there, because there's, well, I couldn't resist bringing this one in. Let's bring Admiral Rob Bauer back on screen. I found this one on his Twitter page. Good to speak with the officers from the hashtag Peace with Women Fellowship, a rich program that not only empowers the participants, but also their respective armed forces. So he's obviously getting a bit of a testosterone kick out of sitting at the table with all these. Well, what are they? Because they can't be women, can they? Because NATO's policy is that women don't exist. So the other point that I was a little bit puzzled about is, of course, all the people dying in Ukraine at the moment are men. So we don't even have Ukrainian equality on the battlefield. Let's get those, whatever they are, because I'm not allowed to call them women, let's get them on the battlefield as well. Sorry to be a bit sarcastic about this, but I found this picture nearly worse than the Ukrainian cadets. because he's just getting an ego trip out of his Twitter page, I think.
Yes. Okay. Well, let's look at how the war is being ramped up with China then. So here is CNBC News. Air Force General predicts war with China in 2025, tells officers to prep by firing a clip at a target and aim for the head. So this was a memo sent by General Mike Minhan, head of the Air Mobility Command. He said, "I hope I'm wrong, but my gut tells me we will fight in 2025. NBC says in the memo sent Friday and obtained by NBC News, Minahan, head of Air Mobility Command, said, oh, that's a repeat, I do apologize for that. He said the memo that because both Taiwan and the United States will have presidential elections in 2024, the US will be distracted and Chinese President Xi Jinping will have an opportunity to move on Taiwan, so that's going to happen. He says he lays out his goals for preparing, including building a fortified, ready, integrated and agile joint force maneuver team ready to fight and win against inside the first island chain. And they go on to say that in fact the US military has confirmed in a statement on Friday that the memo is real. This is an authentic internal memo from General Minhan addressed to his subordinate command teams. His order builds on last year's foundational efforts by Air Mobility Command to ready the mobility air forces for future conflict should deterrence fail. So that's the kind of rhetoric that's going on within the US military at the moment. But what about some of the think tanks and the policy setters? Well, here's RAND, and they're talking about avoiding a long war, US policy and the trajectory of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. And here's the key paragraph. Beyond the potential for Russian gains and the economic consequences for Ukraine, Europe and the world, a long war would also have consequences for US foreign policy. The US ability to focus on its other global priorities, particularly competition with China, will remain constrained as long as the war is absorbing senior policymakers' time and US military resources. So they've got to get this Ukrainian conflict over as quickly as possible, sort out the Russia situation so they can move on to China. Seems to be what RAND is saying.
But I don't think that's going to be happening. And of course, if China now has the hypersonic missiles, then the American carriers that normally operate off the Chinese coast have got a big problem.